It was a crisp autumn evening when Mark, an urban explorer with a passion for abandoned places, found himself standing before the iron gates of the old cemetery at the edge of town. The cemetery was rumored to be forgotten by both the living and the dead, its gates long since rusted shut and its headstones crumbling with age. The air around it was heavy, as if the land itself carried a secret, one that no one had dared to uncover for decades. Curiosity gnawed at him as he pushed the gate open, its squeal echoing like a warning. The cemetery was vast, more expansive than Mark had imagined, with old oak trees casting long shadows across the gravestones. The graves were weathered, some leaning at strange angles, while others had sunk into the earth, leaving only fragments of stone and rotting wood behind. There was no path to follow, only the desolate remnants of graves, each bearing strange, fading inscriptions. Mark's flashlight beam swept across the scene, and that's when he noticed the unsettling detail. The gravestones, though ancient, were missing names. Many of the stones bore dates, but they were only half complete. The year of birth was intact, but the year of death was eerily absent. Some gravestones had no text at all, just a faded shape or symbol carved into the stone. The further Mark wandered, the more he felt the weight of an overwhelming presence, like eyes watching him from the shadows, hidden just beyond his vision. When he reached a particularly worn gravestone, Mark kneeled to inspect it closer. The inscription was nearly illegible, but as he wiped away the dirt, his heart skipped a beat. The death date was current. It was marked as today's date. Suddenly the wind shifted, rustling through the trees and sending a chill through his bones. The ground beneath his feet trembled just a little, as though something deep within the earth was stirring. Mark's flashlight flickered and then went out. Panic gripped him as he pulled the batteries out, fumbling in the dark. The whisper of the wind turned into low, almost imperceptible murmurs. "Stay, stay, stay." The voice echoed from all around him. Mark's pulse quickened. He tried to stand and leave, but the earth beneath him seemed to cling to his every step. His feet felt heavy, as though the ground itself was trying to pull him down. As he turned to make his way toward the gate, he heard the creak of a door behind him. Whipping around, he saw a dilapidated mausoleum, its door swinging open on its own, revealing a dark, cavernous void within. The whispers became clearer, louder, all around him, almost suffocating him with their intensity. "Forgotten, forgotten, forgotten," they chanted, rising into a crescendo. The voices blended into a single guttural sound that seemed to come from the grave itself. Mark's breath quickened, his body frozen in place as if his legs no longer belonged to him. Before he could move, the mausoleum door slammed shut with a violent force, plunging the cemetery into silence. The whispers stopped. The cold grew unbearable. Then from the shadows of the gravestones, something moved. A figure, twisted and grotesque, its body nothing but a shadow of bones and flesh, approaching him slowly. Its empty eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Mark tried to scream, but no sound escaped. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away as the figure reached out with hands that were nothing but jagged, brittle bones. "You are forgotten now. You will never leave." The next morning, Mark's body was found lying at the edge of the cemetery. His eyes were wide open, and his face was twisted in a frozen scream of terror. In his hand was a camera, and the only photo left on it was of a tombstone, the name on the gravestone, his own. Sarah had grown up in a small town, its streets winding through hills and dense forests, with a graveyard that stood on a hill overlooking the town. She had always been drawn to it, especially at night when the fog rolled in, covering the tombstones in an eerie blanket of mist. There were stories that no one dared to speak aloud about the cemetery, tales of strange occurrences, of whispers in the night, of people who ventured inside and never returned. But Sarah had always dismissed them as folklore until the night she went there herself. As she walked deeper into the graveyard, the mist thickened around her, wrapping her in a veil of shadows. The tombstones loomed over her, each one carved with symbols she couldn't decipher. There was something unsettling about the way the gravestones stood at odd angles, some half buried in the earth as if they were trying to escape their resting places. At the far side of the cemetery, she noticed a figure sitting on a bench by the cemetery gates. A man, hunched over, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. His clothing was ragged, his posture slumped as though he had been sitting there for decades. Sarah felt a chill run through her, but her curiosity got the better of her, and she approached him. The man slowly lifted his head, revealing a face aged beyond its years. His skin was thin, almost translucent, and his eyes were dark with a gleam that didn't belong to a living soul. He stared at her for a moment before responding in a voice that was ragged and strained. "Watchman, I am the watchman. I keep watch over the dead who refuse to rest. I keep them here so they cannot escape." "Sarah, what do you mean? What are you talking about?" The watchman's smile was twisted, almost mocking. "Watchman, do you know why this place still exists? It's not for the living, it's to keep the dead in. They can't leave. They can never leave." Suddenly the air grew colder and the ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled. The tombstones seemed to shift, their angles twisting in unnatural directions. The earth groaned as if the cemetery itself was alive. The watchman stood, his movements jerky and unnatural, his body twisting in ways that no human form should. "Watchman, I have to stay. I must keep watch so they never escape. The curse, it's mine now, and now it's yours." The cemetery gate slammed shut behind Sarah with a deafening bang. She turned to run, but the mist closed in around her, thick and suffocating. The watchman's figure loomed in the fog, his eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. The next morning, Sarah's body was discovered just outside the cemetery gates. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in horror. Her hands were outstretched, as though she were trying to grasp something invisible. And beside her, the watchman's figure faded into the mist, his curse forever binding her to the cemetery. The old cemetery on the edge of town had long been abandoned, its gravestones now mere fragments of their former selves, crumbling into the earth. The cemetery was notorious for its eerie stillness and the deep shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the land. But it was the crypt, hidden beneath the earth, that intrigued James the most. Local legend spoke of a sealed crypt, an ancient tomb whose entrance had been hidden and whose contents had been sealed away by the town's founders. On a stormy night, when lightning split the sky and the wind howled through the trees, James stood at the edge of the cemetery, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The ground was slick with mud as he made his way to the back of the cemetery, where an old mausoleum stood, its stone walls cracked and weathered by time. Behind it he discovered the entrance to the crypt, a narrow staircase descending into darkness. With his heart pounding, James descended into the crypt, the air thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. At the far end of the crypt, James found a coffin unlike the others. Its lid was cracked, and the markings etched into its surface were far more elaborate and sinister. The floor around it seemed to have been disturbed, as though something had been moved in a hurry. His curiosity piqued, James pried open the coffin with a crowbar, his hands trembling with excitement and fear. Inside was a figure, mummified yet disturbingly intact. The body was curled in on itself, its hands frozen in a grotesque pose. The face was twisted in a permanent expression of agony, and its eyes were wide open, empty and hollow, staring directly at James. And then, to his horror, they blinked. "Help me!" A voice rasped, a low and hollow sound that seemed to come from the crypt itself. The walls began to shake and the ground trembled beneath James's feet. The cold became unbearable, as though the very air had turned to ice. James stumbled back, but before he could escape, the ground cracked open beneath him. The tombs around him shifted, the dead inside beginning to stir. The corpse in the coffin sat up, its limbs stiff and unnatural, its face contorting into something horrific. Its bony fingers reached out toward James, the cold touch freezing him where he stood. "You've released me," it whispered, its voice like the scraping of bones against stone. "And now, you will never leave." The crypt seemed to close in on him, the tombstones shifting as if the earth itself were alive. James tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the dark, suffocating air. The next morning, the cemetery was as still as ever. The crypt's entrance had been sealed once again, and James's body was found at the edge of the graveyard. His eyes were wide open, locked in an expression of pure terror. His hand still clutched a journal, the final page reading, "It's awake, it's coming for me." Subscribe to Terror Tales, like and share our horror channel for more haunted, mysterious, and disturbing stories. Thank you for watching.